The portraits. Mike walked for 3 hours. The surrounding forest grew thicker and darker with every step. The trees seemed to merge with their crowns, blocking the last traces of daylight. Leaves crunched under his feet, but this sound soon mixed with others, the whisper of the wind and the distant cries of birds. He was sure he knew the way when he started the campaign. But now, the forest is turned into a strange trap, squeezing it like a vice. He stopped to rest and listened. Almost silence, only the wind in the trees. He could no longer hear the current that he had left behind a few hours ago. The compass began to rotate erratically, the needle bouncing as if it had lost its sense of direction. He looked at his watch again, but the darkness swallowed the hands. Ilyamak sat back on his haunches. He looked at the compass on the wall above the kitchen sink, the thick leather collection. The sun had almost disappeared when he saw it, a hut among the trees, barely visible in the deepening twilight. The shack looked old, maybe 100 years or more. He felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Mike approached cautiously, looking around. It was obvious that no one had lived here for a long time. This was betrayed by the overgrown steps and branches hanging over the roof. But at that moment, he didn't care. He just wanted to take shelter for the night. In the morning, he tried to find a way out again. The door was unlocked, and Mike pushed it lightly. Inside, it smelled of dust and wood. A simple room. A rough-hewn table, a couple of chairs, an old stove against one wall. In the far corner, there was a bed with sheets darkened by time. But something else caught his attention. The walls were hung with portraits, 6 or 7, each in its own frame, some cracked and peeling. The people in the portraits were different, men and women, some young, others older, but something in their faces unsettled Mike. He couldn't pinpoint for sure, but the feeling that they were watching him didn't leave him. Their eyes. No, it was just exhaustion. He needed to sleep. The forest, the long march, the fatigue, all this caught up with him. Portraits were just portraits. Mike threw off his jacket, put it on a chair, and lay down on the bed, but sleep did not come. Every time he closed his eyes, it felt like someone was watching him. He sat up abruptly and turned around. The portraits still hung on the walls, but in the semi-darkness, their faces seemed different. Like their expressions changed. Mike swallowed and rubbed his eyes. No, it was just his imagination. This is how it should be. But every time he closed his eyes, this feeling grew stronger. Now he was sure that the portraits were following him. Mike grabbed the flashlight and slowly got out of bed. A ray of light swept across the faces, and it seemed to him that he saw a cruel smile in the eyes of one of the women. "That's ridiculous," he muttered to himself and walked over to one of the portraits. Up close, the faces looked even stranger. They weren't normal, too realistic, and yet there was something wrong with them. The shadows were too deep for a simple painting. The eyes. He leaned closer to examine the old man's eyes in the first portrait. The eyes were real. Mike froze. A chill ran down his spine. It was impossible. He turned away abruptly and headed for the door. He couldn't stay here. He must be going crazy. But something made him stop at the door. He realized that he hadn't heard a single sound outside since he had entered the cabin. It was too quiet in the forest, too dead. His fingers nervously gripped the doorknob, but the door did not move. He pulled harder. The door groaned, but did not open. Panic began to rise in his chest. He rushed to the window, but the frames were tightly closed. Trapped. He's trapped here with those... Look. He turned around and the portraits seemed to change again. The faces became even more sinister. The woman who had been smiling was now smiling openly, her mouth widening and her eyes empty, black voids. The other portraits also changed. Their smiles were distorted. Their eyes became more piercing, as if they all wanted to say something to him. "What do you want?" Mike shouted, backing into the center of the room. He was breathing faster now, a cornered, caged beast. And then he heard it, whispering. Barely audible at first, but it gets louder with every second. There was no doubt the whispers came from the portraits. "Hey, I'm waiting for you," the old man's lips whispered in the first portrait. Cocking his head, he whispered in the second. Mike recoiled, clutching his head, but the voices did not stop. "You have come. Now you are with us. Forever." These words echoed in his head as if they were spoken by all the people in the portraits at the same time. He looked around the room, and it seemed to shrink, the walls closing in front of him. In a frenzy, he ran to the bed, grabbed his backpack, and began to push the bed to the window, intending to break through. But as soon as he touched the glass, he felt cold. Ice. The window was covered in frost, as if it had been enveloped in an icy mist. Mike stepped back, his breathing ragged. In the next instant, the room fell silent. No whisper, no movement, nothing. He slowly turned his head in the direction of the portraits. Now all faces were looking directly at him. Everyone was smiling, their expressions frozen in terrible harmony, as if they were waiting for something. His next step, I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at one of the portraits. The picture trembled. He ran into the night, stumbling over the roots, but did not stop. The branches whipped his face, but he felt no pain, only a desperate desire to get as far away from this hut and its creepy inhabitants as possible. Yeah. He didn't know how long he had been running before he stopped at the cliff. His lungs were burning, his legs were weakening, but he was free. He looked around. The hut disappeared from sight, swallowed up by the dark forest. But Mike could still feel their eyes on him, and their voices. They whispered after him. A week later, the search team found the cabin. They never found Mike. At the entrance, there was only his backpack, and on the wall among the many portraits hung a new one. His face.